On December 5, 1941, 162 days after the largest land invasion in human history began, the German army received orders to stop advancing and dig in, not because they had won, but because they had run out of everything: men, fuel, horses, and time. That morning, across a front stretching from the Arctic to the Black Sea, Soviet forces launched a counteroffensive that drove the Wehrmacht back up to 250 kilometers. The soldiers promised a 6-week campaign were now frozen in positions they had never planned to occupy, wearing clothing their government had never intended for winter, fighting an enemy their intelligence service had said would collapse by August. 3 million men crossed the Soviet border on June 22, 1941. By the time the December counteroffensive began, over 800,000 of them had been killed, wounded, or gone missing. And the war had barely started. This is the story of Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in human history, a campaign designed to destroy the Soviet Union in 5 months, and the structural catastrophe that made German defeat not just possible but, according to modern historians, virtually inevitable from the moment the first shell was fired. To understand what Barbarossa was, you first have to understand what it was not. Neither a conventional military operation nor a war for territory in any traditional sense, Barbarossa was something Adolf Hitler had been writing about publicly since the 1920s, a racial war of annihilation in the East, aimed at destroying what he called Judeo-Bolshevism and seizing what he called Lebensraum, living space for the German people, carved from the Soviet Union through conquest, enslavement, and deliberate mass death. When Hitler signed Führer Directive No. 21 on December 18, 1940, he was not improvising. He was authorizing a plan that had been building in his ideology for 2 decades. Directive No. 21 gave the operation its codename Barbarossa, after the medieval Holy Roman Emperor Frederick I. The plan's predecessor study had been called Otto. That name change tells you something about how Hitler conceived of the whole enterprise, framing it as a civilizational crusade rather than a geopolitical maneuver. The operational concept looked simple on paper. 3 vast army groups, north, center, and south, would drive simultaneously into Soviet territory, with a primary goal that had nothing to do with capturing cities. Their job was to destroy the mass of the Red Army west of the Dwina and Dnieper rivers before Soviet forces could retreat into the vast interior of Russia. Once the Red Army was encircled and annihilated in a series of massive pocket battles, what German doctrine called Kessel, or cauldron battles, the political structure of the Soviet state would collapse on its own. Hitler expected this to take roughly 5 months. His generals promised it would happen in 5 weeks. Germany brought to that opening day approximately 3 million German soldiers reinforced by Finnish, Romanian, Hungarian, Italian, Slovak, and Croatian troops, bringing the total force to roughly 3.8 million men. Backing them, between 3,350 and 3,795 tanks, somewhere between 2,700 and 4,300 aircraft, more than 7,000 artillery pieces, 600,000 motor vehicles, and 625,000 to 700,000 horses. The Barbarossa force represented 67% of the Luftwaffe's total combat aircraft strength, 3.5 of Germany's 5 air fleets committed to a single operation. This was not a sideshow. This was everything Germany had. To understand why the Soviet Union was so catastrophically unprepared for what hit it on June 22, you have to go back 22 months to a signing ceremony in Moscow. August 23, 1939 was the day Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov and German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop put their names to a non-aggression pact that shocked the world. The agreement came with a secret protocol dividing Eastern Europe into German and Soviet spheres of influence. Poland would be partitioned, the Baltic states would fall to Moscow, and 2 totalitarian states that trusted each other not at all would pretend, for the moment, to be partners. What the pact created in practical terms was an economic relationship that benefited Germany enormously. Between January 1940 and the June 1941 invasion, the Soviet Union exported approximately 597 million Reichsmarks worth of goods to Germany, while Germany delivered roughly 437 million Reichsmarks in return. Soviet exports included over 820,000 tons of oil, 1.5 million tons of grain, and 130,000 tons of manganese or strategic materials that helped Germany bypass the British naval blockade. All of it flowed westward right up until the moment Germany turned on the supplier. Hitler had been planning the invasion since July 1940, and Soviet freight trains kept rolling westward into German territory the entire time. This dynamic, a business partner supplying a rival right up to the moment that rival destroys them, maps almost exactly onto one of the most studied failures in modern supply chain theory, known as the trusted supplier blind spot, where organizations become so dependent on a single counterparty that they cannot process early warning signals as threats rather than noise. The Soviet case is the most catastrophic version of that failure in history. Soviet intelligence chief Pavel Fitin received warnings from multiple sources throughout the spring of 1941, and Joseph Stalin dismissed nearly all of them. The reasons Stalin refused to believe what was coming were genuinely complex, and historians have debated them for decades. Gabriel Gorodetsky's study Grand Delusion offers the most compelling explanation. Stalin had constructed an entirely rational but fatally wrong model of Hitler's decision-making, believing Hitler would not open a two-front war while Britain remained undefeated, believing Germany would issue ultimatums before attacking, believing the warnings flooding his intelligence agencies were British provocations designed to drag the Soviet Union into war. Stalin also believed he had more time to complete the military reforms already underway, time to finish preparing the Red Army. Stalin was wrong on every count. The warnings were real. Richard Sorg, the GRU intelligence agent operating out of Tokyo under the codename Ramsey, sent a report on March 5, 1941, pointing to a mid-June attack, then followed it with a May 15 report narrowing the window to between the 20th and 22nd of June. The Red Orchestra network, operating inside Germany itself, sent operational detail and a date of June 21. British intelligence, the United States State Department, through Under-Secretary Sumner Welles to Soviet Ambassador Konstantin Umansky in March 1941, and the NKGB's own reporting, which logged approximately 120 German divisions massing along the Soviet border by late March, all pointed toward the same conclusion. One story that has been repeated endlessly in documentaries is that Sorg gave Stalin the exact date of June 22 and that Stalin ignored it. The truth is more complicated. Sorg gave shifting date ranges across multiple reports, and as late as June 17, 1941, 5 days before the invasion, he remained uncertain the attack would proceed at all. The claim that Sorg pinpointed June 22 with precision is traceable largely to a 1964 Pravda article, written when Soviet authorities posthumously named Sorg a hero of the Soviet Union, an occasion that invited mythology. Historians who have examined the actual GRU signals traffic have found the record to be considerably more ambiguous. What all those warnings achieved, taken together, was to place Stalin in a position where he knew something was coming, chose to disbelieve it, and found himself blindsided anyway. On the evening of June 21, 1941, a German communist soldier named Alfred Liskow, serving with Infantry Regiment 222, swam across the Bug River near the town of Sokol and surrendered to Soviet border guards, telling them a dawn attack was hours away. The warning reached Moscow. Nothing changed. At approximately 3:15 in the morning on June 22, 1941, the artillery opened up along a front roughly 1,800 miles long. The first hours of Barbarossa were among the most militarily one-sided in modern history. Striking simultaneously across the entire front before most Soviet aircraft had even left the ground, the Luftwaffe's opening wave generated claims of approximately 1,811 Soviet aircraft destroyed on that single day, combining ground losses and aerial kills. The Red Army Air Force's own incomplete same-day reports acknowledged at least 1,136 combat aircraft completely destroyed on June 22 alone. These were not just numbers. These were squadrons. Entire air armies effectively ceased to exist before noon. The Western military districts had gone into that morning with approximately 11,357 combat-ready aircraft. Within a week, Soviet air superiority over the front had ceased to exist entirely, and Luftwaffe bombers and dive bombers ranged freely over Soviet columns, supply lines, rail junctions, and headquarters with virtually no opposition. On the ground, the situation was equally catastrophic. Army Group Center, the strongest of the three German formations, with Field Marshal Fedor von Bock in command and two panzer groups under Heinz Guderian and Hermann Hoth, tore through the Soviet Western Front within hours, closing an encirclement around Białystok and Minsk within the first week and taking over 320,000 prisoners. Minsk fell on June 28, 6 days into the campaign. Western Front Commander Dmitry Pavlov, a decorated tank officer who had served in Spain, was arrested, tried, and shot on July 22. His fate sent a message to every other Soviet commander: failure carried a death sentence, and retreat required authorization from Moscow that often arrived hours or days too late to save anyone. At Smolensk, the battle that ran from July 10 to September 10, 1941, roughly 650 kilometers into Soviet territory, the Germans claimed 3,205 Soviet tanks destroyed and over 300,000 prisoners when the pocket closed on August 5. And yet Smolensk produced something unexpected: sustained, organized Soviet counterattacks against the Wehrmacht's flanks, particularly around the town of Yelnya, where German panzer and motorized divisions began taking casualties at rates no one had planned for. The railway gauge problem deserves more attention than it usually receives, because it may be the most consequential logistical fact of the entire Eastern Front war. Soviet railways ran on a broad gauge of 1,520 millimeters. Germany and most of Western Europe used a standard gauge of 1,435 millimeters. That difference of 85 millimeters, roughly 3.5 inches, rendered every Soviet rail line captured by the Wehrmacht essentially useless until engineers converted the track, switching points, bridges, and all associated infrastructure. German rolling stock could not run on Soviet rails. Soviet locomotives could not run on German ones. For a campaign designed to be supplied over lines stretching 800 to 1,000 kilometers from the German border, that was not a minor inconvenience. Captured Soviet territory expanded the front but could not feed the advance, and every kilometer gained meant supplies had to travel further over roads that Germany's motor transport could not fully exploit. 600,000 motor vehicles. Sounds like a lot until you note that the same army also had 625,000 horses. This was not a fully mechanized force. It was a hybrid army whose supply tail grew longer and more fragile with every day of advance, converting captured track under enemy fire. The scale of that interoperability failure has a modern echo. When the European Union mandated USB-C as a universal charging standard in 2022, technology manufacturers faced an adaptation cost of billions of euros to bridge a gap measured in fractions of a millimeter. The Wehrmacht faced the same class of problem across thousands of kilometers, while the engineers doing the conversion were being shelled. Before continuing with the main campaign, there is a story that almost every documentary about Barbarossa tells, and almost every documentary gets wrong. Sitting on the Bug River, right on the border between German-occupied Poland and Soviet-controlled territory, the Brest fortress was attacked by the German 45th Infantry Division when the invasion began at 3:15 on June 22. The Germans expected to take it in approximately 8 hours. Soviet soldiers and civilians barricaded inside the ancient fortifications fought back with a ferocity that defied every calculation, and organized resistance held until approximately June 29 or 30, 8 to 9 days that cost the 45th Infantry Division over 430 men killed. 430 dead represented more than 5% of all German fatalities on the entire Eastern Front for the month of June 1941, an astonishing toll for a single fortress that was supposed to fall in a morning. That is where the documented history ends. The story that appears in Soviet schoolbooks, films, and countless Western documentaries, that the Brest fortress held out for 32 days, rests primarily on the account of Major Pyotr Gavrilov, who was captured near the fortress on approximately July 23 after surviving by hiding in the ruins. The 32 days figure became a cornerstone of Soviet wartime mythology, elevated particularly by writer Sergei Smirnov from the late 1950s onward, during the Khrushchev era, when rehabilitating wartime heroes served political purposes that had nothing to do with historical accuracy. Documented evidence for organized military resistance after June 29 is thin. Scattered individuals hiding in ruins is not the same thing as a coordinated defense. The distinction matters not to diminish the genuine courage of the men who fought and died there in those first 9 days, which was real and extraordinary, but because understanding how the 32-day legend was assembled tells you something about the entire Soviet memory of the war and how propaganda shapes what the public believes it knows about military history. The real story of Brest is that the 45th Infantry Division was told they would take the fortress in hours. They needed 9 days. That tells you something true and important about the campaign they had just begun. By late July 1941, Operation Barbarossa had achieved tactical results that were, by any historical measure, staggering. Army Group Center had advanced 600 kilometers in 5 weeks, Army Group South was grinding through fierce Ukrainian resistance toward Kiev, and Army Group North was pushing through the Baltic states toward Leningrad. On July 3, 1941, 11 days into the campaign, Franz Halder, the chief of staff of the German army, wrote in his war diary that the campaign against the Soviet Union had been won in less than 14 days. Halder was not being ironic. He believed it when he wrote it. And then on August 11, 1941, less than 6 weeks later, Halder wrote something else. At the outset of the war, German planners had reckoned on about 200 enemy divisions, and they had already counted 360. That single diary entry contains the entire explanation for why Germany lost Operation Barbarossa. German military intelligence had catastrophically underestimated the Soviet Union, not just its current military strength, but its capacity to generate new formations, new divisions, new armies from reserves and conscripts that German planners had not known existed. The Wehrmacht went to war with a mental map of Soviet military power that was approximately half the size of the actual map, and the gap widened every week because the Soviet Union was mobilizing at a rate German planning had not modeled as possible. The popular explanation for Germany's failure in Barbarossa is the weather, the mud of October, the frost of November, the legendary general winter that stopped the Wehrmacht before Moscow. That explanation survives in popular culture, in film, in general audience history books. Modern scholarship has largely demolished it. David Stahel, in his multi-volume campaign studies, argues that Barbarossa was effectively unwinnable by August 1941, not December, not November, but August. By that point, the panzer and motorized divisions forming the spearhead of the advance had suffered irreplaceable losses in tanks, vehicles, and trained crews, and German industry was not replacing armor at the rate the campaign was consuming it. The men who knew how to fight in combined arms, tank commanders, reconnaissance units, motorized infantry that worked with armor, were dying or being wounded at rates that could not be sustained. Weather made things worse. But weather was not the cause. The cause was structural, a campaign designed for an enemy that did not exist, fighting an enemy that was far larger, far more resilient, and far more capable of absorbing catastrophic losses and continuing to function than anyone in German high command had predicted. That brings us to August 1941 and the decision that Stahel, Jeffrey Megargee, and most modern historians regard as the final strategic nail in Germany's coffin. Army Group Center had driven to the outskirts of Smolensk by mid-July, roughly 400 kilometers from Moscow. Guderian commanding the 2nd Panzer Group, Hoth commanding the 3rd, Army Group Center Commander von Bock, and even OKW Operations Chief Alfred Jodl were virtually unanimous. The next objective had to be Moscow. Drive hard before Soviet defenses consolidated, before winter arrived, before the Soviet capacity to regenerate divisions outpaced Germany's ability to destroy them. Moscow was not just a capital. Moscow was the hub of Soviet rail communications, and taking it might accomplish what the initial campaign had failed to do: sever the Soviet Union's logistical nervous system and force a collapse. On August 21, 1941, Hitler overruled all of them, issuing a directive that formally ordered Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group to turn south away from Moscow, away from the offensive axis his generals had unanimously recommended, and drive toward Kiev to assist Army Group South in encircling Soviet forces in Ukraine. On August 23 and 24, Guderian flew to Hitler's headquarters at Wolfschanz, the Wolf's Lair, in the forests of East Prussia, and attempted in person to change Hitler's mind. Guderian returned to his command without having changed anything. The panzers turned south. The Kiev encirclement that resulted was, by raw numbers, the largest encirclement in military history to that point. Pincers met at the town of Lotvica on September 16, 1941, and the German army claimed 665,000 prisoners, with recent scholarship placing the figure closer to 452,000, still an extraordinary number. Mikhail Kirponos, commander of the Soviet Southwestern Front, was killed attempting to break out on approximately September 20 or 22. The weeks consumed by the Kiev operation, roughly 6 weeks from Hitler's decision to the closing of the pocket, were weeks that Army Group Center spent stationary or repositioning, burning fuel and wearing out vehicles without advancing on Moscow. Operation Typhoon, the final drive on Moscow, opened on September 30 and October 2. By then, the Germans were racing a deadline they had almost certainly already missed. The Vyazma-Bryansk encirclements that opened Typhoon were tactically spectacular, with German claims reaching 673,000 prisoners and recent research suggesting approximately 514,000. None of it could compensate for what had been lost in time and attrition. October brought the Rasputitsa, the autumn mud season, and roads that were barely roads in summer became impassable quagmires, bogging down vehicles and reducing supply convoys to walking pace or a standstill. Hard frost in mid-November temporarily froze the ground and allowed the advance to resume, and then temperatures continued to fall. By late November, Army Group Center's panzer divisions operated at roughly 35% of their authorized tank strength, with soldiers fighting in clothing designed for a summer campaign in temperatures that plunged to -30 or 40 degrees Celsius. On October 3, 1941, just as Typhoon was getting underway, Adolf Hitler took the stage at the Sportpalast in Berlin and declared that the enemy was already broken and would never rise again. He cited figures: 2.5 million prisoners, 22,000 guns destroyed, 18,000 tanks captured, 14,500 aircraft shot down. Those numbers were propaganda. 6 days later, Reich press chief Otto Dietrich announced to the world's media that the war in the East was essentially over. The Soviet counteroffensive began on December 5. Numbers can obscure what they are supposed to illuminate. The statistics of Barbarossa are so large that they resist comprehension, and it is worth being precise about what they mean. By the end of 1941, the Soviet Union had suffered approximately 4.5 million irrecoverable Red Army casualties, soldiers killed, missing, or captured. That figure comes from Grigory Krivashev's 1993 archival study, the most thorough accounting from Soviet military records, and it is widely regarded by historians including David Glantz as an undercount, because units that were encircled and destroyed often filed no casualty reports. There was no one left to file them. Of those 4.5 million, over 3 million were prisoners taken in the Great Encirclement battles, Białystok, Smolensk, Uman, Kiev, Vyazma-Bryansk. What happened to those prisoners is one of the least discussed mass atrocities of the Second World War. Approximately 5.7 million Soviet soldiers were captured over the course of the war, and roughly 3.3 million of them, 57%, were dead by war's end. The pace of that killing was staggering. By February 1942, just 8 months after the invasion, 3.4 million Soviet soldiers had been taken prisoner, and approximately 2 million had already died from deliberate starvation, exposure, disease, and shooting. 2 million human beings, dead in 8 months. Soviet prisoners of war were, after Jews, the largest group of victims of Nazi racial policy, according to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Their deaths were not accidents of war or failures of supply. They were the result of deliberate decisions built into the structure of the campaign from the beginning. The Commissar Order, issued on June 6, 1941, 2 weeks before the invasion, directed the summary execution of captured Soviet political commissars, and it was issued not by the Einsatzgruppen or the SS but by the Wehrmacht's own high command, distributed through regular army channels and implemented by regular army units. The post-war claim that the German regular army was apolitical and uninvolved in Nazi crimes, what historians call the clean Wehrmacht myth, has been demolished by decades of scholarship. Historian Omer Bartov did much of that demolition work, and the Hamburg Institute for Social Research's exhibitions in 1995 and 2001 documented Wehrmacht complicity in war crimes across the Eastern Front in forensic detail. On September 29 and 30, 1941, 2 days after the fall of Kiev, Sonderkommando 4A of Einsatzgruppe C, with police battalions and local auxiliaries, assembled the Jewish population of Kiev and marched them to a ravine on the northwest edge of the city called Babi Yar. Over 2 days, 33,771 people were shot. The number is precise because the Einsatzgruppe submitted a precise operational situation report. The perpetrators counted their victims. The Wehrmacht's 6th Army, under Field Marshal Walther von Reichenau, cooperated with the operation. This was not a rogue element or a hidden operation. The SS and the Army were not separate machines in the East. They were parts of the same machine, and the machine had been designed to kill. Babi Yar continued as a killing site through the occupation, with total estimates for the number murdered there ranging from 70,000 to over 100,000. A memorial park now stands at the site in Kiev. On March 1, 2022, during Russia's invasion of Ukraine, a Russian missile struck the adjacent Kiev television tower, killing 5 people and damaging buildings near the memorial. One of the enduring questions about Barbarossa is why the Red Army collapsed so completely in those first weeks. An army with 11,000 tanks in its western districts, with millions of soldiers, with enormous quantities of artillery, losing so catastrophically so fast. The answer most people reach for is the purge. Between 1937 and 1938, Stalin's NKVD swept through the Soviet military officer corps with arrests, trials, and executions on a scale that gutted the senior command. 3 of 5 marshals of the Soviet Union were executed: Mikhail Tukhachevsky, Vasily Blyakar, and Alexander Yegorov. Tukhachevsky was arrested on May 22, 1937, tried on June 11, and executed the night of June 11 to 12, roughly 13 to 15 of approximately 15 to 16 Army commanders, 8 of 9 fleet admirals, 50 of 57 corps commanders, and 154 of 186 division commanders were also purged. The popular account diverges from the scholarly record on the scale of those killings, and the divergence matters. The claim that 30,000 officers were shot, or that 50% of the officer corps was purged, appears in countless documentaries and is an inflation. Revisionist scholarship by Roger Rees and others shows that approximately 34,000 to 35,000 officers were discharged or arrested over 1937 and 1938, not all executed, with roughly 30% later reinstated. A 2024 University of Chicago quantitative study, drawing on newly available archival data, found that of 1,844 general-grade officers, over half were repressed in some form, and at least 780 were executed. That is catastrophic. It is not 50% of the entire officer corps dead. What the purge did accomplish, and David Glantz's work in Stumbling Colossus makes this clear, was eliminating 80 to 90% of senior army, corps, and division commanders, the men who understood modern combined arms doctrine, who had studied and practiced how to coordinate tanks with infantry, artillery, and air support. The Red Army that faced Barbarossa in June 1941 was an enormous force led by junior officers promoted far beyond their experience, in the middle of a thorough reorganization that had not been completed. The purge was one compounding cause among several. Between 1937 and June 1941, the Red Army had grown from roughly 1.5 million men to approximately 5 million, a tripling in 4 years, with mechanized corps being reorganized and incomplete, shortages of trucks and radios, and a deficit of the trained staff officers who translate orders into coordinated action. The German army that struck on June 22 was a fully coordinated, combat-experienced force refined by campaigns in Poland, France, and the Balkans. The Red Army it struck was enormous, partially disorganized, and in the middle of reorganizing itself. The mismatch was not only in numbers. It ran through institutional capacity at every level. What happened on the Soviet side in the summer and fall of 1941 is, in some ways, as extraordinary as what happened on the German side, just in the opposite direction. Stavka, the Soviet Supreme Command structure, formed on June 23, 1941, one day after the invasion. The GKO, the State Defense Committee, formed on June 30 with Stalin as chairman. Within days of those structures taking shape, a decision was reached that may have determined the outcome of the entire war. The Soviet industrial base would be evacuated east. Between July and November 1941, the Soviet Union's People's Commissariat of Railways, working under GKO direction, organized the eastward evacuation of approximately 1,523 large enterprises, factories, plants, laboratories, along with their workforces and equipment. The total number of enterprises evacuated, including smaller facilities, reached approximately 2,593. And between 16 and 25 million people were relocated. Kuibyshev, modern-day Samara, on the Volga, became the designated reserve capital, and Vladimir Lenin's embalmed body was moved to the Siberian city of Tyumen for safekeeping. By late 1941, Germany occupied territory that had contained roughly 85% of Soviet aircraft production facilities, 70% of coal output, 50% of steel and aluminium capacity, and 40% of electricity generation from the pre-war western regions. Soviet GDP fell 34% between 1940 and 1942, according to economic historian Mark Harrison, and industrial output did not recover to its 1940 level for nearly a decade. And yet the Soviet Union survived, because the factories were already producing again east of the Urals, in Siberia, in Kazakhstan, in fields that had no infrastructure when the machines arrived, before the German army had fully consolidated the territory it had just conquered. This is not a footnote. This is the hinge of the entire war. The Wehrmacht could destroy an enormous fraction of Soviet military and industrial capacity in the summer of 1941. What it could not destroy, what it could not reach fast enough, was the organizational will and capacity to relocate the means of war production beyond the reach of German armor. On July 3, 1941, 11 days after the invasion, as Army Group Center was closing its first massive encirclement, Joseph Stalin delivered a radio address to the Soviet people. He opened with the words, "Comrades, citizens, brothers and sisters, I am addressing you, my friends." The manuscript of that address, later published by Russia's Presidential Library, shows something revealing. The original draft opened only with "Comrades." The intimate brothers and sisters was added afterward. Stalin, or a speechwriter, understanding that a different register was needed, that the relationship between the Soviet state and its people had to be reframed for total war. The speech announced a scorched earth policy. What could not be evacuated would be destroyed, machinery wrecked, railways sabotaged, food stores burned, wells poisoned. German forces advancing into Soviet territory would find a country that had been stripped of anything useful before they arrived. German supply lines, already stretched to breaking point by the gauge problem and the distances involved, advanced into emptiness. After the war, the German generals wrote their memoirs. Guderian wrote Panzer Leader. Erich von Manstein wrote Lost Victories. Halder testified at Nuremberg and gave interviews. What emerged from those accounts, taken together, was a remarkably consistent narrative. The generals had been right, Hitler had been wrong, and if only the Führer had listened to his professional military advisors, Germany could have won. The Moscow versus Kiev decision is the centerpiece of that argument. Guderian, Bach, and Halder all insisted that if Guderian's panzers had not been diverted south in August 1941, Army Group Center could have driven on Moscow before winter and taken it, ending the war. The generals, in this telling, were military professionals who lost a war because a political fanatic overruled them at the critical moment. Modern scholarship has subjected that narrative to considerable skepticism. The argument that Army Group Center could have successfully driven on Moscow in August 1941 immediately after Smolensk, with panzer divisions already badly attrited, with supply lines stretching 800 kilometers back to the German border over roads that were already failing, runs into a significant body of evidence that the Moscow thrust would also have failed, just in a different location. The Imperial War Museum's assessment, shared by a number of operational historians, is that Army Group Center was too weak and too exposed after Smolensk for an immediate Moscow drive to succeed. The flanks were open. Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group and Hoth's 3rd Panzer Group had been fighting continuously for 6 weeks, and tank availability in panzer divisions was already falling sharply. A Moscow drive in August might have reached the outskirts and then stalled, with open flanks, overextended supply lines, and a Red Army that was generating new armies faster than German intelligence was tracking them. What Guderian, Manstein, and Halder were constructing with their post-war memoirs was what historians call the general's alibi, a narrative that placed all causal responsibility for Germany's defeat on Hitler's amateur interference, exonerating the professional military from shared responsibility. The narrative is partially true. Hitler did make catastrophic decisions. The Kiev diversion almost certainly hurt the campaign. But the fundamental misjudgment of Soviet strength, the logistics that could not support the distances involved, the ideological framework that turned a military campaign into a war of racial extermination, none of those were Hitler's decisions alone. The generals planned and executed Barbarossa. The Commissar order ran through Wehrmacht channels. The starvation of prisoners happened under Wehrmacht jurisdiction. The clean Wehrmacht myth and the general's Wehrrecht narrative are two sides of the same coin, both ways of managing the professional and moral responsibility of Germany's military leadership for what they did in the East. Of all the narratives that cluster around Barbarossa in popular history, one of the most persistent concerns the intelligence networks that tried to warn Moscow and whether those warnings were used. The Lucy Ring is a particular favorite. Rudolf Roessler, a German exile living in Switzerland, reportedly received highly classified information about German military operations through sources never fully identified and passed it to Soviet intelligence with a precision that made the network legendary. Repeated in many accounts of the Eastern Front, the claim is that the Lucy Ring warned Moscow of the Barbarossa invasion in advance. That claim is false. A CIA historical review of the actual radio traffic from the Rote, the 3 transmitters that constituted the Lucy Ring Swiss operations, found that the network was not established until approximately August 1941, more than a month after Barbarossa began. Roessler's direct connection to Moscow was not operational until summer 1942. Lucy's genuine intelligence contributions came later, at Stalingrad, and crucially at Kursk in 1943, where information about German operational plans proved significant. Lucy did not warn Moscow of Barbarossa. Lucy did not exist as an operational network when Barbarossa began. The Lucy myth serves a narrative function. It creates a story where a mysterious network with possibly ultra-level sources was feeding Moscow precise intelligence that Stalin foolishly ignored, making the intelligence failure more dramatic and more personally culpable. The reality is more diffuse and more troubling. Stalin received multiple imperfect, partially accurate, partially uncertain warnings from multiple sources, constructed a rational but wrong model of Hitler's intentions, and made decisions based on that model that proved catastrophically incorrect. There was no single smoking gun. There was a pattern of evidence that Stalin misread. The Soviet counteroffensive that began on December 5 and 6, 1941, was planned by Georgy Zhukov, appointed commander of the Western Front, the force defending Moscow, in October. Zhukov had organized the defense of the city through the terrifying weeks of October and November, when German forces got close enough to Moscow that Stalin evacuated most of the government to Kuibyshev while himself remaining in the Kremlin. The forces Zhukov used for the December counteroffensive were not the elite Siberian divisions that have become legendary in some accounts. The claim that Sorga's intelligence allowed Stalin to transfer large Siberian armies westward, confident Japan would not attack in the east, has been significantly overstated in popular history. The actual transfer involved approximately 3 divisions in the October to December period, not the multiple armies of popular legend. What Zhukov had was Soviet soldiers better equipped for winter than their opponents, a supply situation that, while difficult, was less catastrophic than the Germans, and the momentum that comes from an enemy that is stopped. By December 1941, the German army on the Eastern Front had suffered over 830,000 casualties. Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge's own November 1941 reports put Panzer Division tank availability at approximately 35% of authorized strength. Writing to his wife around that time, Guderian put it plainly, "We have seriously underestimated the Russians, the extent of their country and the treachery of their climate. This is the revenge of reality." On December 8, 1941, 3 days after the Soviet counteroffensive began, Hitler issued Directive No. 39, ordering the German army onto the defensive. The advance was over. Army Group Center, pushed back up to 250 kilometers in some sectors, proved one thing above all others: Hitler's October 3 Sportpalast declaration that the enemy was already broken and would never rise again had been wrong. The Soviet enemy had risen again. No discussion of Barbarossa's historiography is complete without addressing one of its most contentious debates, one that touches directly on how Russia and the former Soviet states understand the origins of the war. In the 1980s, a former GRU officer writing under the pseudonym Viktor Suvorov published a book called Icebreaker, arguing that Stalin had planned to attack Germany in the summer of 1941, and that Barbarossa was a German preemptive strike against a Soviet offensive already being prepared. The argument rested on the positioning of Soviet forces near the western border in June 1941, which Suvorov read as offensive deployment rather than defensive preparation, and on various aspects of Soviet military doctrine and industrial planning. The mainstream historical response to Suvorov's thesis has been largely negative. Gabriel Gorodetsky's Grand Delusion, David Glantz's extensive archival work, and the research of Antony Beevor and Dmitry Volkogonov all conclude that Stalin sought not to launch war in 1941 but to delay it, ideally to 1942 or 1943, when the Red Army's reorganization would be complete and Soviet industrial modernization further advanced. Soviet force positioning near the border reflected the disorganization of a military in the middle of reform rather than the forward deployment of an attacking army. A minority of historians, including some Russian and German researchers, have found partial merit in elements of Suvorov's argument, but the consensus of the field is clear: Barbarossa was not a preemptive strike against an imminent Soviet attack. It was an ideologically driven war of conquest and annihilation that Hitler had been planning since 1940 and had committed to publicly since the 1920s. Accounting for what Barbarossa cost requires holding multiple scales simultaneously, because the losses were so vast that no single framing captures them. For the Red Army, Krivyshev's archival study puts total Soviet military deaths across the entire war at 8,668,400. The 1941 campaign alone, Barbarossa through Operation Typhoon, to approximately December 1941, accounted for roughly 4.5 million irrecoverable losses, and other researchers argue the true 1941 total was significantly higher, because encircled units that were destroyed left no records. For Soviet civilians, German occupation by late 1941 covered territory containing enormous shares of Soviet agricultural and industrial production, and the deliberate starvation policies applied to POWs and occupied civilian populations alike killed millions more. Total Soviet civilian and military deaths across the war are generally estimated at 27 million, with some estimates running higher. For Germany, over 830,000 casualties by late December 1941, roughly 20% of the force committed, with Luftwaffe losses in aircraft and aircrew severe and the Panzerarm that crushed France in 6 weeks reduced to a fraction of what it had been. Unlike the Soviet Union, which was replacing losses with new formations as fast as its relocated factories could produce equipment, Germany faced a strategic arithmetic that could not be made to work. The Soviet industrial evacuation of 1941 is one of the greatest logistical achievements in the history of organized human activity, and it is almost entirely absent from popular understanding of the war. 1,523 large factories were dismantled, loaded onto roughly 1.5 million railcars worth of trains, and reassembled in the Urals, Siberia, and Central Asia, often in fields, under open sky, in winter, while the workers lived in tents, with production beginning at the new sites within weeks of arrival in some cases. The scale of that achievement becomes clearer in comparison. When semiconductor manufacturer TSMC announced in 2020 that it would relocate some production capacity to Arizona, the project was projected to take several years and cost tens of billions of dollars, and it involved moving equipment by air freight to an already developed industrial site with full infrastructure. The Soviets moved heavier equipment, over longer distances, to sites with no infrastructure at all, in wartime, in winter. Nothing in modern logistics history comes close. The consequences of Barbarossa extended far beyond 1941 and far beyond the Soviet Union. The Eastern Front was the central front of the Second World War. More soldiers died there than on every other front combined, more territory changed hands, more cities were destroyed, more civilians were killed. The Holocaust accelerated dramatically after June 1941 as the Einsatzgruppen followed the Army East and the Generalplan Ost's vision of racial reorganization began to be implemented in blood and ash. The Second World War's final shape was determined on the Eastern Front. The Red Army that reached Berlin in 1945 was shaped by the catastrophe of 1941, by what it learned from that catastrophe, by the commanders who survived it, and by the organizational reforms that followed. Georgy Zhukov, Konstantin Rokossovsky, Alexander Vasilevsky, Ivan Konev, the men who won the war for the Soviet Union were men who survived the disaster of Barbarossa and drew the right lessons from it. The Great Patriotic War, as Soviet and Russian tradition names the conflict from June 22, 1941, to May 9, 1945, remains the foundational event of Russian national identity in a way that has no Western equivalent. Victory Day on May 9 is the largest public commemoration in Russia, and the iconography of the war permeates Russian political culture at a level that shapes how Russia understands itself and its relationship with Europe. That has not remained academic. When Russia launched its invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, the official justification included claims of denazification, a deliberate invocation of the Great Patriotic War's iconography, deployed to frame a 21st-century military invasion using the language of the most destructive conflict in human history. Historians across Europe and the United States condemned that framing as a deep distortion of what the Second World War was and what it meant. The Babyn Yar Holocaust Memorial Center, under development at the Babi Yar site in Kiev since approximately 2016 and projected for completion around 2025 to 2026, represents Ukraine's effort to reclaim the memory of its own wartime suffering. On March 1, 2022, a Russian missile struck the adjacent Kiev television tower, killing 5 people and damaging buildings near the memorial site. The war of memory and the war of weapons intersecting at the very place where Sonderkommando 4A had killed 33,771 people over 2 days in September 1941. The historical record, read through the best available scholarship, gives a clear answer on Operation Barbarossa. The invasion was conceived as an ideological war of annihilation from the beginning, not as a conventional military campaign that subsequently descended into atrocity. The Commissar Order, the Einsatzgruppen deployment, the deliberate starvation of Soviet POWs, the Generalplan Ost framework, these were not departures from the campaign. They were the campaign, its purpose and its method. The failure of Barbarossa was structural, not meteorological. Stahel's argument that by August 1941, the outcome was already determined by irreplaceable losses in German armored forces, the collapse of the logistics system, and the catastrophic underestimation of Soviet military strength, represents the mainstream of current scholarly opinion. General winter is a comfortable myth that allows the German catastrophe to be attributed to bad luck rather than to systematic failures in planning, intelligence, and strategy. Several of the most popular episodes in the Barbarossa story are either mythologized or false. The 32-day Brest fortress defense is a legend built from the 1950s onward. The claim that Richard Sohr gave Stalin the exact date of June 22 is a post-1964 inflation. The Lucy Ring did not warn Moscow of Barbarossa. Hitler's October 3 kill count figures were propaganda. The general's alibi narrative that professional soldiers would have won if only Hitler had not interfered is a self-serving post-war construction that obscures the complicity of the Wehrmacht in war crimes and the shared responsibility of the officer corps for the decisions that produced defeat. Soviet survival was not inevitable. It required the evacuation of the industrial base, the organizational capacity to generate new armies faster than Germany could destroy the old ones, and ultimately the willingness to absorb casualties that would have collapsed any other state in European history. The Red Army's irrecoverable losses in 1941 alone, roughly 4.5 million by the archival count, likely more by any realistic accounting, exceeded the total military forces of most countries that fought in the war. And the legacy of what happened on the Eastern Front has not been settled. The archives are still being opened. The casualty figures are still being revised. What Barbarossa means, who it belongs to, what lessons it teaches, which facts are allowed into the official story, remains a live question in ways that reach from memorial sites in Kiev to debates about security guarantees in Brussels. Large historical forces, ideology, logistics, intelligence failure, strategic miscalculation are real. They played out in the lives of specific human beings, and it is worth pausing on a few of them. Franz Halder wrote on July 3, 1941, that the war was already won. By August 11, he had written that German intelligence had misjudged Soviet military strength by a factor of nearly 2. Halder served as Army Chief of Staff until September 1942, when Hitler removed him after disputes over the Stalingrad campaign, and after the war, he became the primary architect of the general's alibi, the narrative that exonerated the professional military for Germany's failures. Halder lived until 1972. Guderian flew to Wolfschanz in August 1941 to argue against the Kiev diversion, failed to change Hitler's mind, turned his panzers south, participated in the largest encirclement in history to that point, then turned north again and drove toward Moscow as part of Typhoon. He wrote to his wife in November 1941 that reality had taken its revenge. Relieved of command in December 1941 after withdrawing troops without authorization, Guderian was eventually recalled, survived the war, and wrote a memoir that became one of the most influential accounts of the Eastern Front and one of the most self-serving. Mikhail Kirponos commanded the Soviet Southwestern Front, the force defending Ukraine and Kiev. Kirponos repeatedly requested permission to withdraw from the developing Kiev encirclement before it was too late. Permission was denied. The pocket closed on September 16, 1941. Kirponos was killed attempting to break out on approximately September 20 or 22. He was 52 years old. Dmitry Pavlov commanded the Soviet Western Front, the formation directly in the path of Army Group Center's opening blow. His front was shattered in the first days, and on July 22, 1941, Pavlov was arrested, charged with cowardice, failure to command, and dereliction of duty, and shot, chosen as a scapegoat for a catastrophe that had structural causes beyond any individual's control. He was posthumously rehabilitated in 1957. Alfred Lisko swam a river on the night of June 21, 1941, and told the truth. Soviet propaganda briefly used him, then in January 1942 he was arrested. He disappeared into Siberia sometime around 1943, and the circumstances of his death have never been confirmed. These are the threads that make up the texture of historical catastrophe. The decisions made at the top by heads of state, by army commanders, by intelligence chiefs, filtered down through layers of organization until they arrived at men on riverbanks at night, at generals in encircled pockets waiting for orders that did not come, at prisoners in camps who died of cold and hunger in weeks. Franz Halder's July 3 diary entry, "The campaign against the Soviet Union has been won in less than 14 days," is one of the most famous examples of premature certainty in the history of warfare. Halder was not simply a fool. He was an experienced professional soldier who had correctly assessed the military situation as he understood it. The problem was that the reality he was assessing, Soviet military strength, Soviet industrial capacity, Soviet political resilience, was fundamentally different from what German intelligence had told him it was. Operations planned around incorrect models of the adversary's strength will fail when they encounter the actual adversary. Systems designed for enemies that do not exist cannot adapt quickly enough to enemies that do. The gap between what German intelligence believed about Soviet military capacity in June 1941 and what that capacity actually was, not 200 divisions but 360, not a political structure that would collapse under pressure but one that reorganized, evacuated its factories, and kept fighting, that gap was not discovered in time to change the plan. The warning signs were there. By August 11, Halder knew the count was wrong. By November, Guderian knew the enemy was stronger than expected and the climate was more brutal than planned for. Wehrmacht operational situation reports consistently noted panzer divisions below strength. Supply convoys struggling, the enemy counterattacking with forces that had not been anticipated. And yet the institutional commitment to a particular model of the campaign, the sunk costs in men and material and credibility, the ideological framework that made Soviet resilience literally unthinkable, all of it combined to prevent the kind of strategic reassessment that might, just might, have altered the outcome. Operation Barbarossa lasted 162 days, from June 22 to December 5, 1941, when the Soviet counteroffensive before Moscow began. In those 162 days, the German army advanced further, faster, and against stronger opposition than any army in modern history had previously managed. Army Group Center covered approximately 1,000 kilometers from the German-Soviet border to the outskirts of Moscow. Army Group South took Ukraine, including Kiev, and the largest encirclement in history. Army Group North reached Leningrad and began an 872-day siege. And none of it was enough. The Soviet Union lost more soldiers in those 162 days, more than 4.5 million irrecoverable casualties by the archival baseline count, than most countries deployed in the entire war. The Soviet Union lost territory containing the majority of its pre-war industrial base. The Soviet Union lost its entire forward air force in the first days, its most experienced senior commanders in the purge of 1937 and 1938, and its strategic surprise in the first hours of June 22. And the Soviet Union survived. David Stahl argues Barbarossa was unwinnable by August. The logistics could not support the distances, the intelligence was wrong about the enemy, and the ideology that drove the campaign also prevented the political flexibility that might have exploited genuine anti-Stalin sentiment in some occupied territories. The army of horses and trucks could not sustain an 800-kilometer supply line in converted-gauge rail country while simultaneously conducting offensive operations on an 1,800-mile front. The question of whether a differently planned Barbarossa concentrated on Moscow from the start, without the Kiev diversion, with proper winter supply preparation, could have succeeded remains genuinely debated. Most historians conclude that the structural problems were too deep to be solved by better operational decisions. A few argue a slim chance existed. What is not debated is what Barbarossa actually was, a war of racial annihilation, built into the campaign from the orders distributed before the first shell was fired, executed by the Wehrmacht alongside the SS with a thoroughness that left behind a trail of murdered prisoners, massacred civilians, and deliberately starved populations. The violence that was the purpose of the campaign was also a strategic liability, one the German High Command was ideologically incapable of recognizing. A campaign designed around the racial subjugation and mass murder of the people in the territory it was conquering could not convert those people into allies or collaborators who might have eased the supply problem or undermined Soviet political control. On December 5, 1941, Georgy Zhukov sent his armies forward into the Moscow frost. Army Group Center, which had advanced 1,000 kilometers in 148 days, was pushed back up to 250. The war on the Eastern Front would continue for 3.5 more years. What had been promised as a 5-week campaign became, by the first week of December, something no one in German High Command had planned for, modeled for, or equipped for, a war of attrition against a continental power that was replacing its losses faster than Germany could generate them. In that gap, between what was planned and what was real, between what German intelligence said existed and what actually existed, lay the answer to why the largest invasion in human history ended not with the collapse of the Soviet Union, but with German soldiers ordered to dig in and survive a winter no one had told them was coming. The Brest Fortress Memorial in Belarus, the Babin Yar Memorial in Kiev, the graves of German soldiers in the frozen ground east of Moscow, all of them mark the same territory, in the same ground, from the same campaign. The question worth sitting with is not simply who won and who lost. It is whether a campaign built on the premise that an entire civilization could be erased would ever have been capable of achieving anything other than what it actually achieved, a catastrophe so vast it reshaped the world, and a legacy still being contested in the same cities where it began.